At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched among the rubble of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. His eyes were fixed on a towering banyan tree about 240 yards away, peering through a scope that his fellow officers had mocked for weeks. At 27, George was an Illinois state shooting champion, but until now, he had 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had at least 11 snipers lurking in the Point Cruz groves. In just the past 3 days, they had taken the lives of 14 men from George's 132nd Infantry Regiment. His commanding officer had dismissed his rifle as a toy, and platoon leaders teased him, calling it his mail-order sweetheart. When he unpacked the Winchester Model 70, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount, back at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer had raised an eyebrow. "Deer or Germans?" he asked. George replied simply, "Japanese." The rifle hadn't even arrived before George shipped out. He spent the journey to Guadalcanal watching others clean their garrons while his own weapon sat back in Illinois. He requested it be sent via military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate stamped fragile. Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The weapon weighed 9 pounds, with the scope adding another pound and a half. By comparison, the standard Garand issued to his fellow soldiers was heavier, had no magnification, and carried 8 rounds semi-automatically, while George's was bolt-action, 5 rounds. Captain Morris had ordered him to leave the sporting rifle behind, to take a standard military weapon instead. George ignored the order. By late December, the 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal. The Marines had fought relentlessly since August, taking Henderson Field and holding it, but Mount Austin remained in Japanese hands, along with the dense coastal groves west of the Matanacor River. The mountain, 1,514 feet tall, was known to the Japanese as the GEU, 500 men, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17. 16 brutal days later, after 34 killed and 279 wounded, they finally secured the western slope on January 2. Through it all, George hadn't fired his Winchester once in combat. The jungle near Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had fallen back from Henderson Field, taking cover in massive trees. Some were snipers, armed with Arisaka-type 98 rifles, expert in the jungle, patient, and deadly. On January 19, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. The next day, 2 men from L Company were picked off during a patrol. On the 21st, 3 more died, including one shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice before. That night, George's battalion commander summoned him. The snipers were cutting down men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could actually shoot, and he wanted to know if George's civilian rifle could perform under fire. George laid out his credentials: Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, youngest winner at age 23, capable of 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, and 5-round groups inside 4 inches at 300 yards with a Lyman Alaskan scope. The commander gave him until morning to prove himself. George spent the night meticulously preparing. The Winchester had been coated in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again, checked the scope mounts, and loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee, the same caliber as the Garand. At dawn, January 22nd, he moved into position inside the ruined bunker, overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence indicated the snipers were hidden in the giant banyan trees, some reaching 90 feet high with trunks 8 feet across. A skilled sniper could climb one of these giants before sunrise and remain invisible all day. George had no spotter, no radio, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began scanning the trees through the 2.5x Lyman Alaskan scope, every sense alert. The movements were subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye, but George had learned to notice even the slightest shift in the branches. The jungle was never quiet. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, artillery boomed in the distance. Yet he had trained himself to ignore the noise and focus only on motion. He scanned the trees slowly, methodically, left to right, top to bottom. At exactly 9:17, he saw it, a tiny flicker of a branch. No wind, no other disturbance, just a small, deliberate movement. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away, a figure appeared. George watched carefully. The branch shifted again, and then the shape became clear. A man, dressed in dark clothing, perched in the fork of 3 large branches. The Japanese sniper was facing east, keeping a watch on the trail where George's battalion had been hauling supplies. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks to the right to account for wind, and controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was incredibly smooth. 2 pounds of resistance, fine-tuned over hours at Camp Perry before the war. Now it would prove whether a civilian hunting rifle could outmatch a soldier trained to kill him first. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked into his shoulder, the shot cracking through the jungle air. 240 yards away, the sniper jerked, then fell. His body tumbled 90 feet through the branches, landing hard at the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt, ejecting the empty casing, chambering another round, and kept his eyes on the tree. Nothing moved. But he knew the shooter likely had a partner nearby. Japanese snipers always operated in pairs, one to fire, one to spot. George methodically scanned the surrounding banyans. The 2.5x scope forced him to search carefully. Each tree could hide multiple men, and the shifting canopy created shadows that could fool even the trained eye. At 9:43, he spotted the second sniper. This one was in a different tree, about 60 yards north of the first, roughly 50 feet up. The soldier was descending the trunk, retreating after hearing the first shot. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper toppled backwards, his rifle clattering through the branches. Both men hit the jungle floor within moments of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. Reloading from a stripper clip, George's hands were steady, his breathing controlled. It felt no different from practice at Camp Perry, except here, the targets fought back. By 11:21, a Japanese bullet splashed dirt 6 inches from his head, striking a sandbag and sending debris into his face. He rolled left, pressed against the bunker wall, and waited. The shot had come from the southwest, a new direction. After 3 tense minutes, he inched back into position, glassing the trees in that direction. Snipers always move after shooting, classic doctrine, but in the dense jungle, relocation was tricky. By 11:38, he found the third shooter, perched 73 feet up in the third tree of a 5-tree cluster. The sniper had shifted branches but stayed in the same tree, a fatal error. George put his crosshairs on the dark figure and fired. The third sniper dropped silently. By noon, George had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. The word spread quickly through the battalion. Men who had once mocked his mail-order rifle now asked to watch him work. George refused. Spectators would draw attention, and attention could get you killed. After the 5th kill, the Japanese adapted. They no longer moved in daylight. George spent the rest of the afternoon scanning the trees, but found nothing. The battlefield had changed, but he had made his mark. At 1,600 hours, George returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting, but the teasing tone from before was gone. The captain wanted George back in position at first light. January 23rd started with heavy tropical rain, turning the jungle floor into thick mud and reducing visibility to barely 100 yards. George hunkered down in his bunker, waiting for the storm to ease. By 8:15, the rain finally let up, and by 8:45, enough light returned for him to work. At 9:12, he spotted his first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had used the rain to his advantage, moving into position while the downpour masked every sound. He had picked a tree 290 yards away, longer than the previous day. They were learning, adapting to George's skill. George adjusted for distance, held his breath, and fired. The sniper went down. That was George's 6th confirmed kill. But this time, there was a response he hadn't expected. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began landing around his bunker. They had triangulated his position, likely using the flash or sound of his shots. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The next salvo, 20 yards short. The third round was aimed directly at the bunker. George didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, sprinted north along the treeline, and dove into a shell crater just as the third round exploded where he had been moments before. The bunker disintegrated into a cloud of debris. He relocated to a new position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. It offered cover and a clear line of sight over the groves. Settling in, he resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They had realized George was hunting them, and now the hunters had become the hunted. This was no longer a practice range or a shooting competition. This was a deadly duel. At 14:23, George took out his 7th sniper. At 15:41, the 8th fell. This one had climbed 94 feet up a banyan tree, well hidden, but the angle of the sun created a silhouette against the sky. By 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to call George in. He had been in position for 9 hours straight. Reporting his numbers, George confirmed 8 kills in 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, for misses. Morris immediately assigned him to continue sniper operations at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and ran the numbers in his head. 11 snipers were known to operate in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. Only 3 remained, and they were likely the most skilled, the ones who had survived longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like, and the rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds into his Winchester and tried to sleep. By 3 o'clock, he gave up and sat in his tent, the rifle resting across his lap. At 4:15, the rain began again. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time wisely, moving to a new position the Japanese would not expect. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous spot. The Marines had used it as a machine gun nest back in December. It offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to ease. By 7:43, the downpour slowed to a drizzle and visibility improved. George began scanning the trees. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. This Japanese soldier had chosen a low position in a palm tree, only 40 feet off the ground, 190 yards away. Most snipers preferred height for better sightlines, but this one prioritized concealment. The palm fronds created a natural hide, invisible from ground level, but George wasn't on the ground. Elevated on the rocks, George had a perfect vantage point, looking down into the palm fronds. He could make out the dark silhouette of the sniper's shoulders and head. George raised his rifle, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he paused. Something didn't feel right. The position was too obvious, too easy. He had been hunting snipers for 3 days and had already taken out 8 men. The remaining 3 weren't going to make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't perch themselves in a spot visible to an elevated shooter, unless it was a trap. George lowered his rifle and carefully scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real enemy would be positioned to cover him, waiting for any sign of movement, watching for muzzle flash, ready to strike. He systematically glassed every tree within 300 yards of the palm, methodically left to right, top to bottom. 11 tense minutes later, at 8:28, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the decoy. 91 feet up, hidden among branches and vines on 3 sides, the sniper had a perfect view of George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear or take the bait shot. George had 2 problems. First, if he fired at the Real sniper, the sound would immediately reveal his own location, giving the enemy a chance to relocate before he could chamber another round. Second, if he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and start searching. He decided to use the bait. George fired at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusting carefully for wind. The man jerked and tumbled from the fronds. Instantly, George swung his rifle toward the banyan tree. The real sniper would react to the noise, and any movement would give him away. He saw it, a slight shift as the sniper turned toward him. George put the crosshairs on the dark silhouette and fired before the enemy could fully rotate. The Real sniper fell, his rifle clattering after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But now George's position was exposed. He grabbed his rifle and ammo and sprinted east along the rocks, dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire ripped through the rocks where he had been just moments before, kicking up dust and debris. 17 seconds of deadly fire. Once it stopped, George waited a full 60 seconds before moving again. He relocated to a new position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. Kneeling in the water up to his chest, he rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed scanning the trees. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remained, the final, most dangerous sniper. This 11th man would be the smartest, most experienced of them all. He had seen 10 comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, his rifle, his approximate position, and somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. George studied the jungle through his Lyman Alaskan scope. The magnification revealed distant shapes but didn't identify them. Every shadow, every dark spot could be a branch or a man. He examined each carefully, aware that one mistake could be fatal. At 9:47, he realized his error. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees at all. He was on the ground, moving toward George's position. In the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, a low shape slipped through the undergrowth, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover, crawling silently toward the rocks where George had been. George stayed completely still in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was shouldered, his breathing steady, but the angle was tricky. The rim of the crater blocked a clear shot, and the final duel was about to begin. George's view of the approaching sniper was partially blocked by the rim of the crater. To take a clear shot, he would have to rise, but rising would expose him completely. The Japanese sniper froze at 9:52, just 40 yards from the rocks. Through his scope, George watched the man study the terrain, scanning for any sign of movement. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon, staying perfectly still, letting time do the work, waiting for the perfect shot rather than forcing one. At 9:58, the enemy moved again, creeping forward 35 yards. 30 yards. 25 yards. He was approaching from the south, the same direction George had used when evacuating under machine gun fire. George understood immediately. The sniper had observed the earlier assault and now was following the most likely escape path, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. By 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He climbed into the old machine gun nest and took a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the spot where George should have relocated. The sniper was now only 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was looking the wrong way. His back was completely exposed. It should have been an easy shot, center mass, 38 yards. Even without a scope, George could have taken it. But he hesitated. This was no ordinary soldier. This man had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. 10 other snipers had died because they made mistakes. This one would not. The rocks were far too exposed for a sniper of his experience. This had to be bait. George kept the sniper in his sights, but expanded his focus. If this was a decoy, the real threat would be somewhere nearby, covering the false position with a clear line of fire. At 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, crouched behind a fallen tree. Motionless, watching, waiting, his rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch where George might be hiding. 2 men, not 1. The final snipers were working together, numbers 10 and 11, supporting each other. George had a problem. With his bolt-action Winchester, he couldn't shoot both before they reacted. Working the action between shots would give them time to locate and fire back. He needed a smarter approach. Slowly, he lowered himself deeper into the water, until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed upward to prevent water from entering the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks rose. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch, convinced George had moved farther east. Signaling to his partner behind the tree, the two began sweeping east, moving parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, planning to flush George out. George stayed perfectly still in the water. The 2 soldiers passed his crater, their backs exposed. Slowly, silently, he rose just enough to bring the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, his uniform, and his face. He aimed at the closer target, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away, and fired. The man dropped instantly. George worked the bolt, chambered around, and swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle, but George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had eliminated the threat that had killed 14 Americans in just 72 hours and cleared the Point Cruz groves for his battalion. As George climbed out of the crater to collect his spent cartridges, a sound froze him in place. Voices. Japanese voices coming from the treeline. Multiple men were moving toward the fallen soldiers. He had killed the snipers, yes, but they hadn't been operating alone. George dropped back into the cold, muddy water, submerging until only his eyes remained above the surface. He held the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. Branches snapped, equipment rattled. These weren't snipers, this was infantry. Likely a patrol or a recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds, tense and silent. The voices stopped at the first body, just 42 yards from his crater, close enough that he could hear the tones even without understanding the words. Then the group moved to the second corpse. Urgent whispers, movement, the sound of searching. At 10:28, they started coming back toward him, not retreating toward the treeline, but toward his crater. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks. He had been careful about noise, but not about leaving evidence behind. 5 rounds in his Winchester, at least 6 soldiers advancing. The odds were grim for a bolt-action rifle. George considered his options: stay hidden and hope they passed by, or fight. The voices drew closer, 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. Then, at 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, staring directly at him. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. George fired from the water. The man fell backward. Working the bolt while still submerged, George chambered another round. 2 more soldiers reached the crater rim. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both went down. 3 rounds remained. Shouts echoed through the jungle as more soldiers closed in. George climbed out on the north side, away from the approaching voices, sprinted 20 yards, and dropped behind a fallen tree. Rifle fire cracked through the trees, bullets kicking up dirt around the crater and his new cover. The enemy was firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. He scanned through his scope and spotted 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead man and fired. He dropped instantly. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. Then George realized the Japanese were flanking him. One group coming from the south, another from the east. He was at risk of being surrounded. A firefight was no longer an option. A bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatics would be suicide. He had to break contact and move toward the American lines. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north through the jungle undergrowth. Vines snagged his boots, branches whipped his face, bullets snapped past, striking trees and dirt all around. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater, this one dry. Pressing against the wall, he listened. The voices had grown distant. They hadn't pursued, likely regrouping around their dead. He checked his rifle. Mud caked the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. Only 2 rounds left, no stripper clips. The remaining clips were back at his previous position. George allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath. The danger wasn't over, but for now, he had survived. After catching his breath, George realized something important was missing: his pack. It had been dropped somewhere near that muddy, water-filled crater. By 10:47, he started moving again. No sprinting this time. He kept his head low, moved slowly, and used every dip in the ground to stay hidden. He angled northeast, back toward American lines. The jungle felt different now. Quiet. No enemy voices, no branches snapping, just George's breathing and the distant rumble of artillery rolling across the island. At 11:13, he finally reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry spotted him and challenged him. George identified himself, and the guard waved him through. He went straight to battalion headquarters to report to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full rundown of everything. George gave it to him: 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 shots fired. 11 hits. Then the firefight with infantry, 3 more confirmed kills, 5 rounds expended. Morris asked how much ammunition he had left. George told him, 2 rounds. Morris asked about the condition of the rifle. George admitted it still worked, but it was filthy. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris ordered him to clean the weapon and get some rest. No missions the next day. The battalion was shifting east anyway. The Point Cruz groves no longer mattered. The Japanese were already pulling out of Guadalcanal. Intelligence believed they'd be gone within 2 weeks. Back in his tent, George disassembled the Winchester and spent nearly 2 hours scrubbing every piece. Cosmoline, oil, fresh patches through the barrel until everything came out spotless. He checked the scope mounts, fixed the eye relief, and loaded 5 clean rounds. At 1,400 hours, a messenger arrived. Division headquarters wanted to see him. George walked over, wondering if this was bad news. Maybe Morris had complained about him acting on his own, using too much ammunition, or breaking protocol. Instead, when he arrived, Morris was waiting with 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry got straight to the point. Could George teach other soldiers to do what he did? George said he could try, but only if he had time, scoped rifles, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry told him Division had 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unertl scopes, sniper rifles the Marines had left behind. And there were 40 expert marksmen in the regiment who had qualified before deployment. Ferry wanted George to form a sniper section, train them, establish tactics, and clear out any Japanese snipers still harassing American units. George agreed, but he asked for one thing in return. He wanted to keep using his own Winchester. Ferry approved it. So George kept his Winchester Model 70, and the 14 scoped Springfields went to the men he would train. Training started on January 27th. George gathered 40 men at a rough shooting range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. They were excellent marksmen on paper, all qualified with iron sights out to 500 yards, but none of them had sniper combat experience. None had ever killed an enemy from concealment. George began with the basics: breathing, trigger control, reading the wind. The Springfield rifles, with the unertl scopes attached, weighed about 11 pounds. Heavier than the Garand and heavier than George's own rifle. The added weight made them steady, but exhausting to hold for long periods. George taught them to use anything solid for support: fallen logs, rocks, roots, sandbags. In the jungle, perfect firing positions rarely existed. You had to build your own stability from whatever was around you. Range training lasted 3 days. They shot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then at moving targets, and finally at silhouettes partially hidden behind brush. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could reliably hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under realistic field conditions. George split them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to find targets and cover the shooter. After a kill, the pair could swap roles to keep both men sharp and avoid relying on a single marksman. On February 1st, George led 4 of the teams into the jungle. Their assignment: sweep Japanese positions west of the Matanaco River. Intelligence believed small enemy groups were still hiding out there. These weren't snipers anymore, just infantry, stragglers who hadn't managed to evacuate yet. At dawn, George's 4 sniper teams moved into position. He paired up with Corporal Hayes as his spotter. They settled on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using to move supplies. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the path. Hayes confirmed the target through his binoculars. George fired. The soldier went down immediately. He worked the bolt, scanned the area, and saw no other movement. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more soldiers along the trail. 7 shots, 6 hits, 1 miss due to wind. Meanwhile, the other 3 teams reported similar results. By the end of the day, 23 Japanese soldiers had been taken out with 0 American casualties. Operations continued through early February. By February 9th, George's sniper section had confirmed 74 kills. That number was conservative, counting only bodies they could actually verify. During this period, Japanese evacuation efforts intensified. At night, destroyers pulled troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to intercept them, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions to cover their retreat. George's teams were tasked with targeting these rearguard soldiers to disrupt the evacuation. On February 7, while operating near the Tanamboa River, George was hit. A Japanese rifleman's bullet struck his left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him down. Hayes dragged him to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned and sutured the wound, assuring him he would recover but needed at least 3 weeks of rest. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their withdrawal from Guadalcanal. By February 9, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it abandoned. The campaign was over. Over 12 days of operations, Georgia's sniper section had tallied 74 confirmed kills, with 0 friendly casualties. The unit was officially recognized by division headquarters, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was far from finished. While recovering, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new, classified mission in Burma. George volunteered immediately. By March, he was aboard a transport ship headed west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed securely in a waterproof case, and the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oiled cloth. Details of the Burma mission were scarce. George only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations deep behind enemy lines, the kind of work where a rifle capable of hitting targets at 600 yards would be invaluable. The transport reached India on April 3. There, he and 200 other officers were briefed. They would join a new 3,000-man unit that hadn't received an official designation yet. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Officially, the 537th Composite Unit was designated on May 28, 1943, but training had already been underway since April. The focus: long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after the British Chindits, small, mobile forces capable of deep operations behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role wasn't listed as a sniper. The Army didn't formally recognize sniper positions in its organizational tables, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation from Guadalcanal had followed him. Battalion Command knew exactly what he could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the core principles remained the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The jungles of Burma would be far more challenging: steeper slopes, heavier undergrowth, and a relentless environment that tested every skill George had honed in the Pacific. The Burmese jungle was a completely different challenge: dense vegetation, steep slopes, constant rainfall, and an enemy that knew every inch of the terrain better than any American force. George adapted his equipment for this mission. The Winchester Model 70 had served him well on Guadalcanal, but that was short-range work with regular supply lines. Burma meant patrols lasting weeks, carrying everything on their backs for hundreds of miles through unforgiving jungle. Every ounce counted. George swapped out the Lyman Alaskan scope for a lighter Weaver 330. The magnification remained the same at 2.5x, but the scope saved 8 ounces. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version, trimming the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not huge on paper, but over long patrols carrying 60-pound packs, every ounce mattered. In February 1944, the Marauders entered Burma. Their objective: advance through northern Burma and capture Myitkyina airfield, a key point for Allied supply lines into China. The Japanese controlled the area with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders' route was grueling: mountains, rivers, dense jungle, and no roads, only narrow trails. All supplies had to be carried, either by the men or by pack mules. No vehicles, no artillery support, just rifles, mortars, and speed. George's battalion began its march on February 24. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases rose daily. Pack mules struggled, and several had to be put down after breaking legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had marched 217 miles, engaging Japanese forces 12 times in small skirmishes and ambushes. The Marauders weren't meant to hold territory. They moved fast, harassed supply lines, and created chaos behind enemy positions. George fired his Winchester 3 times during the campaign. once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun nest, and once at 290 yards to take out a sniper pinning down a patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired more than a single round per engagement. The bolt-action report was distinctive, unlike the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence, a second could give the enemy time to respond. George learned to shoot and immediately relocate. The march to Myitkyina lasted 3 months. By late May, the marauders had covered over 700 miles. Disease had claimed more men than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. Of the 5,300 men who entered Burma, fewer than 3,000 remained combat-capable. On May 17th, they captured Myitkyina airfield. The mission succeeded, but the cost had been severe. The unit was exhausted, sick, and combat ineffective. George survived. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had been so lethal on Guadalcanal was only used 7 times in 3 months. Most engagements in Burma were close-range, ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense jungle where visibility barely stretched 30 feet. George realized that while the Model 70 was an incredible bolt-action sporting rifle, modern warfare was evolving. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would demand different weapons and tactics. By June 1944, George was evacuated with the Marauders as the unit disbanded. He was reassigned to training duties in the United States. His Winchester would never see combat again. In July, he arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, promoted to captain. His mission now was to train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics, passing on everything he had learned in Guadalcanal and Burma: how to move through jungle, identify and engage distant targets, and operate independently without supply lines. The Winchester Model 70 traveled with him everywhere, from Illinois to Tennessee, Guadalcanal, India, Burma, and finally to Georgia. It had at least 14 confirmed kills, probably more. George stopped counting after Burma. The rifle rested now, a silent witness to some of the most intense and dangerous sniper operations in World War II. The Winchester Model 70 rested quietly in George's footlocker at Fort Benning. He rarely glanced at it. The war had moved on. American forces were reclaiming islands across the Pacific, advancing through France, and pushing into Germany. The age of individual marksmen relying on privately owned rifles was fading. Armies were standardizing, mass-produced weapons, interchangeable parts, soldiers trained the same way with the same gear. George understood why it was necessary. Modern warfare demanded industrial efficiency. But he couldn't help feeling something important was being lost: the skill of the individual, the craftsman approach to soldiering. The idea that one man, with the right rifle and training, could shift the outcome of a battle. George left the Army in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and used the GI Bill to enroll at Princeton University. He studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. Afterward, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then another 4 in British East Africa, studying regional politics and governance. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., serving as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, later consulting for the State Department on African affairs. During all those years, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but they had no idea about Point Cruz, the Japanese snipers, or the Winchester Model 70 tucked away in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down his experiences, not for the public, just for his own record. He wanted to preserve the tactics and lessons of jungle warfare while they were still fresh. 6 months later, he had a manuscript over 400 pages long. A friend at the NRA read it and suggested he publish it. George hesitated. The book was highly technical, full of details about rifles, ammunition, and ballistics, not exactly mainstream reading. But the NRA convinced him, and it was published later that year under the title Shots Fired in Anger. The book became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. George described Guadalcanal and Burma with precision, no exaggeration, no self-aggrandizement, just careful observations of what worked in combat and what didn't. Even today, it remains a reference for collectors and historians studying World War II small arms, and his accounts of Japanese weapons are among the most detailed from that era. George lived long enough to see the United States fight in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles, from the Garand to the M14 to the M16, and the formal rise of sniping as a military specialty with dedicated training. He saw the lessons of World War II being rediscovered and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70 was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it sits behind glass. To most visitors, it looks like an ordinary vintage hunting rifle. But it is not. This is the rifle that allowed a state champion marksman, armed with a mail-order scope, to outshoot trained Japanese snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in just 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the U.S. military viewed individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story inspired you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories from dusty archives every day, tales of riflemen proving themselves through skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community spans the globe. You're not just a viewer, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if a family member served. Tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring John George's story isn't lost to history. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.